Colonel Langer is here in the audience, and he has agreed to come in today and is available for questions. But at this point, I have no intention of calling Colonel Langer. But like I say, he is here. We do have Commissioner Harrington here with us at the table, and I want to thank you, Commissioner, for coming back in and going through some questions today with respect to the riots. And today, what we're really talking about, Commissioner, are the riots from May 26th in reality through the end of that week. But as far as our schedule is concerned, we could go through June 10th. But what we're really interested in, I think, is what went on through roughly, say, Monday, June 1st. I think that's really the timeline that we're talking about. And what I'd like to do, Commissioner, is just walk you through a timeline, see if you agree with me. And then I want to read a couple of quotes from the May 29th press conference that you and the governor had, just to give you an idea as to what's coming. The timeline, Commissioner, that I have looked at, in terms of the rioting and the protesters and so forth, looks to me like it starts on Tuesday around 4:30. There's protesters, and by 5 o'clock, there's some really large protesting that is beginning in Minneapolis. And then on Wednesday, we have in the afternoon around 3:30, we got protesters returning to the third precinct. And by 7:15, demonstrators, are widespread, and there is rioting and looting and arson that is occurring. By Thursday, May 28th, we have riots that are now continuing in Minneapolis and have now spilled over into St. Paul. And the third precinct in Minneapolis is evacuated, and eventually rioters breach and loot and burn the third precinct. On Friday, there's more looting, more rioting, more arson. There's a curfew in effect, but as I understand, largely being ignored. And it's reported that by the Department of Public Safety that law enforcement agents have had live rounds fired at them. Then on Saturday, around 2 o'clock, there's a very large rally at the 5th precinct. Around 4 o'clock, MnDOT begins to close down all of the highways, all the major highways in the metro. That evening, more reports of live rounds being fired at the Minneapolis Police Department personnel. And then I believe it was that night, then approximately 2,700 National Guardsmen were deployed to help quell the riots. A question, Commissioner Harrington, does that recitation of the facts, and I know it's very general and broad, but does that recitation of the facts sound accurate to you?
Mr. Chair, I would say generally yes. There's some key moments that happen in between some of those, and I would add in that long before the National Guard hit the streets, the Minnesota State Patrol had been there almost from the very beginning, and we continued to build the resources from the Minnesota State Patrol in Minneapolis day by day, even before by Friday we started to see, Thursday to Friday, when we started to see the National Guard move in. The National Guard absolutely was an essential component of that, but the State Patrol was holding their own, and were tasked with several missions before that, and successfully completed every mission that they were given.
Yeah, and I agree with that, Commissioner Harrington. But I think that the point that I was trying to make is, by and large, during the course of that week, there was widespread criminal activity in the form of riots and arson and looting throughout Minneapolis and into St. Paul. That's the point that I'm trying to make. I'm simply asking whether you agree with that or not.
Yes, I do.
Okay, thank you. Then there's a couple of quotes that I want to ask you about, and this is from the press conference of May 29th. Do you have that press conference in mind, Commissioner?
There were a lot of press conferences, but generally speaking, I think I do have that one in mind, sir.
There's two quotes that I want to ask you about from the governor, and I believe that you were there. And one of the quotes the governor said is, "I want to be very clear and speak to the community. The very tools that we need to use to get control, to make sure that buildings aren't burned and the rule of law collapses, are those very institutional tools that have led to that grief and pain." Do you agree with that statement by the governor, Commissioner?
Mr. Chair, I do.
And then the other quote from the governor is, "And I want to just be clear, there's philosophically an argument to be made that an armed presence on the grounds in the midst of where we just had a police killing is seen as a catalyst." Do you agree with that, Commissioner?
Mr. Chair, I do again.
Then two quotes from you at the press conference. "We talked about the fact that we were going to be respectful of people's rights and that we were going to keep the peace and make people safe." Did you make that statement, Commissioner?
That is consistent with my values, yes, I believe I did.
And finally, we are fully confident that we can do the mission and that we can do it while ensuring that the constitutional rights of those who need to have their voices heard and need to freely assemble and be protected. Did you make that statement?
That is also something that I would say, yes, and I do believe I did say that.
Thank you, Commissioner. And that brings me to my question. You know, the right to protest, the right to freedom of speech, clearly is a constitutional right that is given to everyone, irrespective of race, creed, gender, national origin, and of all those protected classes of people. And that's something that I think that, you know, both you and I agree with. My question is, Commissioner, is, you know, given the comments by the governor, given the comments that you had, and the fact that there's an enormous amount of criminal activity that is going on within the city of Minneapolis and St. Paul during this period of time, and of course all of those folks who want to legally protest and exercise their freedom of speech, you know, their rights have literally been hijacked. And not are able to express themselves. And our ability to listen to what they have to say, that's also been hijacked. So my question is, Commissioner Harrington, were you and the governor having any kind of a philosophical debate within yourselves as to whether to use force to stop this criminal activity, or when to use the force to stop the criminal activity, keeping in mind that these riots went on for like 5 days? Is there a philosophical conflict going on in your decision-making process during those 5 days, which maybe slowed down your reaction to bringing enough force to the street to stop the criminal activity?
Mr. Chair, no, there is not. I specifically said, I think at that same press conference, almost echoing your words, that in fact those who were crying out for justice for George Floyd's voices could not be heard because of the criminal activity that was going on the streets of Minneapolis, and that part of the mission that the state was bringing to bear was to allow for those folks that wanted to lawfully protest and to grieve to be able to do so. We recognize that there was both criminal activity and that there were First Amendment right activities going on, and that we also recognize that as what we believed to be a tactic was that those folks that were bent on criminal activity were using First Amendment freedom of speech activities as a cover for committing criminal activity. That was one of the reasons that we made the recommendation to the governor to impose a curfew, which would have removed folks that were generally out there just to protest lawfully, and would have made it more easy for us to identify those folks that were out there with a criminal bent. And that is in no small part what made us successful on Friday, Saturday, and ongoing, was once we imposed the curfew and once we were able to sort of sort out who was out there and eliminate some of the big crowds, we were far more effective as a strategy and as a tactical approach to making arrests. We made a huge number of arrests once we were able to sort that out. But in the midst of a crowd of, well, at one point, I believe at the 5th Precinct, we were facing a crowd between 4,500 and 5,000 people that was mixed. How do you decide which of those folks are the lawbreakers and which of those are folks that are simply caught up in the minute? And using broad strokes of force at that point did not seem like it was the appropriate thing to do. And so we wanted to make sure that we had the right tactics and the right people and the right message as we were moving forward. And we did that deliberately every day that the state was involved in this.
Well, wouldn't you agree, Commissioner, that before the folks who want to express their legitimate first constitutional, their freedom of speech, their First Amendment rights, that first you have to bring the criminal activity under control? Wouldn't you agree with that?
I agree with it, but I guess the question is, it's a tactical question as much as it is a philosophical question of how do you do the one without doing the other. And so we found it very difficult to do the one of saying we're going to make mass arrests of 4,500 people, which with a couple hundred troopers was not going to happen, first of all. So part of the question is, can you actually do what you're saying you're going to do? And then secondarily, is it the right thing to do at that point? In our minds, what we were going to do was we were going to go out and we were going to make the announcements. We were going to have people that could leave and want to leave. When we did that on Lake Street, that's exactly what happened. We made our announcements. The majority of the people left, and what was left, we could then make the good faith judgment that they were folks that had made the decision either to exercise their right to be arrested, or they were out there for other less lawful reasons. Those folks got taken into custody. So I think we recognized that both of those things needed to happen. The question was how to get that done, and did you have enough resources to be able to make that happen in an effective and a safe manner?
Well, the resources, Commissioner, of course, were available had the guard been requested earlier. But, you know, and I appreciate your answer, Commissioner, and I know that these were not easy decisions. But I will honestly have to say that I question the wisdom of the decision-making process when the riots went on for 5 nights. Before a sufficient show of force was present in order to stop the criminal activity. And until the criminal activity is stopped, I don't see how the folks who wanted to express their right to protest could be put in place. So they're just my thoughts, Commissioner, and I appreciate your answer. You and I over the years have had pretty blunt conversations at times, and I always appreciate your perspective. But I just wanted you to know where I was coming from, and it's very difficult for me to understand the length of time that the riots and all of that criminal activity was occurring before enough personnel was put on the street to stop it. And while I have great respect for folks who want to protest and exercise the freedom of speech, I really don't have a lot of respect for criminals and people who are loot and are arsonists.
On that, Mr. Chair,
there was an enormous amount of criminal activity.
We are in agreement on that point, exactly so.
Okay, thank you.
If I could say one more thing?
Certainly, Commissioner, go ahead.
So part of what I want you to understand is also the timing of this. So historically, and I've been a chief of police of a major city, St. Paul, and chief of a secondary or a specialty police department. Historically, when a protest or a riot takes place in a city, the city normally is the primary response agency. So if we had a riot in St. Paul, I and my folks would immediately move to take care of it. We would call in our mutual aid and we would do what we needed to do to take care of it. And if it got to the point where it was beyond our capacity to do so, we would then call in even greater mutual aid, whether it was calling in the State Patrol, the National Guard, Minneapolis, or other surrounding areas. That's typically how things went. On Tuesday, as we were watching the initial protests, the state leaned into this. Colonel Langer moved to have people out in Minneapolis so that we would have a presence in Minneapolis even before Minneapolis had specifically requested our assistance. Now, in part, that was to make sure that we were prepared in case we had a freeway protest or something along that lines. But as the evening went on, we began to bring in additional resources for just that reason. I reached out to the city of Minneapolis to see if they were going to need resources, not so much because I was concerned about the first night, because a night of protest in Minneapolis is certainly not something that I haven't seen before. I've been through lots of protests in Minneapolis, and most of them are settled by Minneapolis, in Minneapolis, with Minneapolis resources, and not much other assistance in that regard. But because I was really very concerned about the potential of a 75,000 person protest coming in on Saturday, with intel that we had that we were going to have buses of folks coming from out of state to join into that protest. Because of that, I reached out to Minneapolis to see if they might need assistance for Saturday, and that was the call that I made to General Jensen to ask him to start thinking about what was the readiness of the Guard. Because if I brought in what we normally would bring in for the troopers, which is the metro area troopers, and if you had all of Minneapolis and you had all of St. Paul together, I wasn't sure that that level of resource was going to be adequate to deal with potentially 75,000 or more with big national speakers coming in. So the state leaned in initially to try and both asked if there was a need for help, and then to set the stage by setting up Colonel Langer and General Jensen to make sure that they were already starting to think about how would we have the resources necessary. Now, I will fully admit that as I looked at Tuesday night, my impression of that was that this was not necessarily something that was going to go on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and on. I expected it was a 1 or 2 night event, and that it would end as the events that I had seen in the past had ended in Minneapolis. By Wednesday morning, when it had not, that generated the call, or Wednesday night, that generated the next call to General Jensen to say, I think we're going to need you sooner than later, and calls to Colonel Langer to say, I think you need to lean in a little more and think about who else we could start bringing in. So I don't disagree with you that we could have brought people in sooner. That absolutely is the case.
And I appreciate that, Commissioner, and I understand now from the testimony that we've been hearing for the last few days, and from what you have had to say, I do understand when you made the decisions and were asking for help. And my criticism, Commissioner, is that I question whether you and the governor failed to recognize the threat to the public safety in Minneapolis and St. Paul in time. Clearly, the level of criminal violence was escalating rapidly. And you are telling us that you were asking for help from the National Guard because you were anticipating a very large rally of 50 or 75,000 people. But the criminal activity was already ongoing, and it was violent, and it was spreading rapidly. And that's my criticism, is that I question whether or not you failed to recognize that things were getting out of control and beyond the locals' capacity to handle it in time. That's my criticism.
It's fair criticism, sir, and I can certainly respect the criticism, so.
Senator Osment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Harrington, it became fairly obvious at some point that the Minneapolis response, whether it be Tuesday or Wednesday, was both overwhelmed and unprepared. At what point did you feel that there was going to have to be some step in from the state level? At what point did you and the governor decide that Minneapolis is not going to be able to handle this and we need to take action? When did that occur?
I believe it was Mr. Chair, I believe that occurred Thursday as we saw the 3rd Precinct fall. We had seen the 3rd Precinct attacked one day. State Patrol had moved in to help assist Minneapolis to protect the 3rd Precinct on that day. The second day, we had been asked to, again, assist Minneapolis to protect the 3rd Precinct, and so that Minneapolis could quell the disorder on Lake Street, and we had not seen the disorder abate in a material fashion. By the 3rd day, when we saw the 3rd Precinct fall, there was a conscious decision to say we need to now bring in a different level of authority into this. And that was when we began essentially assembling this multi-agency coordinating force. And that was anchored by the Minnesota State Patrol, but was joined by the Minnesota DNR, was joined by Hennepin County Sheriffs and several other local police agencies, and then supported by the Minnesota National Guard. And there was a movement where we created an active plan with a mission to restore order on Lake Street. We operationalized that plan with a start point, a start time, a list of assets, a specific list of goals and objectives, a muster time, and a route as to how we were going to do that. By 3 o'clock in the morning, ballpark, we were operationalizing that plan with a movement of hundreds of officers and National Guard folks onto the Minneapolis streets. We then moved east from Hiawatha and Lake Street to take back the area that had been under control, leaving National Guard folks stationed at strategic points to hold corners. We then moved back toward Hiawatha and moved back toward what now we think of as the 5th Precinct, toward Nicollet, to reclaim that area, and once again left National Guard folks there to hold those corners. So at that point, I would say that the state had really begun to assert that we needed to have a multi-agency, more focused response to the rioting that was there.
Senator Osmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So 3 a.m., was that 3 a.m. Friday morning when you would consider operational control removed from the Minneapolis police, or was that 3 a.m. Thursday morning? Because if it's 3 a.m. Thursday morning, then this is before the 3rd Precinct burned. This is before my understanding that the Minneapolis mayor made the decision to abandon the precinct. So if that's, it's very important whether it's 3 a.m. Friday or 3 a.m. Saturday.
It's 3 a.m.
Thursday.
Friday morning. So it's the 5:29, 3:30 a.m. The team is on Lake Street at Hiawatha.
Senator Osmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So until that point, Minneapolis has been controlled. So functional control at 3 a.m. Friday morning had moved away from the state, and then Minneapolis police were subordinate to the control of the state at that point in time. Is that a correct statement?
Mr. Chair, Senator Organ, no, I would not say that's the case. Minneapolis is a city of the first class. They were in charge of their police department. At no time did the state take over running the Minneapolis Police Department or dictate how the Minneapolis Police Department was to operate. The state assembled a series of assets and resources so that we could take on specific missions in support of keeping Minneapolis safe, and then ultimately to keep St. Paul and other cities safe. But at no time did the city of Minneapolis subordinate their authority to the state of Minnesota.
Senator Osmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Commissioner Harrington, though, for any of the other police agencies that were feeding in support structure, because there are many counties that were providing officers, there are many suburban jurisdictions that were providing officers, were they then under the control of the state and not under the control? As you stated, Minneapolis is independent and their police department is independent. Were those individuals then reporting to the state?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Senator, I would argue that, yes, they were, as we began moving into a multi-agency coordinating center under a unified command. Those officers from additional counties and jurisdictions that came to assist us were operating under state authority and under state guidance.
Senator Osmick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Harrington, can you refresh my memory? On Tuesday, they had protests. I believe on Wednesday there was a curfew by the city of Minneapolis at some point. I'm just checking, when were curfews started? I know that the governor eventually became involved, but can you identify the curfews that were put into place, including Friday, and I know Saturday, and I know Sunday? When were those put in place?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, I don't recall Minneapolis doing a curfew until the state did a curfew. As my recollection is that we asked the governor to consider a curfew. The governor agreed, and then the Minneapolis and St. Paul agreed to also pass city ordinances or orders that would bring their curfew into alignment with the state's curfew. And I will have to look for a second to try and remember whether, I believe it was Friday that we had our first state curfew by executive order.
Commissioner, if you want to look, go ahead.
Thank you. At 5 p.m., Mr. Chair, on 5 p.m. on 5/29, Executive Order 20-65 implemented a nighttime curfew in Minneapolis, and St. Paul was finalized.
Senator Osmick.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Harrington. I just want to make sure I have it set in my mind where those curfews started, because it seems to me Tuesday was a precursor to Wednesday. Wednesday escalated. Thursday even got worse. I'm a little amazed that there weren't curfews in at some point in time. Can you explain what activities and how many people were arrested under the first curfew on Friday?
Commissioner Harrington.
What actions were taken?
On 5/29, 117 people were arrested. 95 of them were arrested by the Minnesota State Patrol. I don't have whether those were arrested for curfew or for other violations, but that's the total number of arrests that we tracked on the 29th.
Senator Osmick.
And looking back at this, of course, hindsight is 20/20. Do you think that an earlier intervention by the state would have helped the cities dealing with this situation? I mean, we all know that we can always be Monday morning quarterbacks, but do you think that an earlier intervention would have changed the outcome that we would have seen on Thursday, Friday, and even Saturday?
Commissioner Harrington.
Mr. Chair, Senator O'Rourke, if we could have mobilized the right staff and implemented the right tactics, yes, I do. When the State Patrol and the multi-agency group was assembled, and when they were directed, they were successful essentially 100% of the time. Would they have been, could we have assembled them on Tuesday or Wednesday? We might have been able to assemble by Wednesday, that's possible. Tuesday would have been problematic simply because much as General Jensen talks about, assembling all of the troopers from all over the state means somebody has to get in a car, drive, come place stage, get equipped, get staffed, and get assigned. And so it's not a turnkey operation at that point. It would have taken some time to mobilize them, to get them to the proper staging point, and then to get them all operating as a unit. But if we had had the resources, the success that they had in virtually every, or not virtually, every task that we gave them makes me think that we would have seen a difference in how long this went. Now, that is speculative on my part because I will be, as I said before, when we saw what was going on Tuesday night, I was expecting that might be a 1 or 2 night event and be over with. When it turned into a 3, 4 night event, I had to change my viewpoint on this. And as we began watching what was happening nationally and seeing these kind of events happen all over the place, it also colored my take on how likely this was to be simply a localized event and whether or not we were going to have enough local resources to be able to respond to it. But in short answer to your question is if we could put the right people in the right place at the right time, given the success that I saw the state and other local assets have, I think we could have made a difference.
Senator Osmick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple more questions. Commissioner, I was shocked when Minneapolis completely abandoned a precinct. Absolutely shocked. Was the governor or yourself aware that Minneapolis had made that decision? And did you intervene at any point in time to question whether that was a wise decision to watch a precinct burn to the ground?
Mr. Chair, Senator, no, we did not intervene. No, I'm not sure whether the governor was aware of it. I do not believe that he was. I knew that Minneapolis had a plan for how they were going to handle their precinct, that they were going to fortify it, and that they had a plan. Beyond that, as a local issue, I did not think it was my place to ask more than you've got this taken care of, and what do you want us to do? Because that's really what my questions were at the time was where do you want the State Patrol? Where do you want state assets? Where can we be of most assistance to you? They gave us those tasks, and we worked on those tasks. And I didn't concern myself directly until far after that with whether or not any other tasks in the city of Minneapolis were done or undone at that point.
Senator Osmick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Harrington, wasn't it obvious on Tuesday and Wednesday, based upon social media traffic, that this was escalating, that by Wednesday night going into Thursday, that this is not just going to be a couple of day event, that this is going to escalate? Because we know that our law enforcement agencies aren't working in a vacuum. They take multiple sections of information and media and take that into account. This was rapidly, even from a senator who happened to be 300 miles north of here, I could see this rapidly escalating. Did you and the agencies, ignoring Minneapolis at this point, their leadership structure, didn't that give you a tip-off that this was going to be something more serious than a 1 or 2 night event?
Commissioner Harrington.
Mr. Chair, Senator, no. In my initial assessment of this, I believed it was going to be a 1 or 2 day event. By the 3rd day, that opinion was shifting. Past history in Minneapolis had been for an occupation. So we had seen that in the 4th precinct. We had seen that tactic as a fairly regular tactic. The complete destruction of a precinct was not something that I envisioned as being on the horizon, and nor was I alerted to that as being something that was a major concern, other than that they were going to try and fortify the outside of the 3rd precinct.
Senator Osmick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I appreciate your candid responses. I know that a lot of members of the Senate and constituents of this state wanted to hear what actually happened, because I think sometimes we sort of lose track of the series of events that took place to get to the disaster that we're at. So now I ask you about what are we going to do in the future? Obviously, we've learned from this experience. What is the plan? Because tensions, I don't think, have gone down a lot. They've de-escalated a bit, but I think considering we have 4 police officers who are currently on trial, you never know what a jury's going to do. You don't know what a judge is going to do. I mean, yesterday it was reported that there's a dismissal being requested for one of the officers who I think was on the job for 4 days. That is something that social media can easily distort, and I think we've heard that earlier today, how social media can completely distort something. And that could be another trigger point to start this all over again. And what hasn't been burned can burn even more now. So explain to me what you've prepared for, knowing full well we still have a tinderbox that all it needs is a match. What is your plans for the rest of this summer? And what can you tell us that you're planning so that we as citizens understand that we've got a plan, we've learned from this, and we know what to expect and be prepared for?
Commissioner Harrington.
Mr. Chair, I would say there are 3 pieces to that. Number one, we are much more attuned to protests and marches than we were before. I, on a daily basis, now brief the governor on protests that we are tracking, and many of them are quite simply very benign, but we are tracking them now, and we are doing a better job through the BCA and others to try and track who are the organizers and what is the history of those organizations in terms of civil unrest, so that as we are looking at, for example, a march where there is a group that has done freeway marches before, we are now pre-positioning assets to around that march so that there will be a visible disincentive for doing a freeway incursion. So one of the things that we're doing is we're doing a much better job, or at least we're attempting to do a much better job of paying more strict attention and to digging deeper into the information that we're able to obtain. And that was something that we would be aware of protests that involved state assets. So if someone said they were going to march on 94, my ears would perk up. I would contact Colonel Langer. Oftentimes, Colonel Langer had it even before I did, and we would then start having that conversation. Now we're having the conversation that says, well, they're not talking about going on the freeway, but the organizations that are doing this have had that history, and we need to now be actively involved with planning about that. That brings me to the second piece, which is that we have to do a better job in partnership. One of the things that we know worked was when we put together the Multi-Agency Coordinating Center. Bringing the resources together allowed us to have a variety of both physical, human, and other capabilities that the state alone does not have, and that only through partnerships could we have those things all brought together in one coordinated spot. So one of the lessons learned is that we have to do a better job of making sure that we have a regular conversation with our partners who are out there to make sure that they are, has their training kept up? Do they have the resources that they need? Are they, in fact, aligned with us? And are we constantly in conversation with them so that we can, in fact, either mobilize their assets or move to support them when that happens. So that would be my second answer, is that we're going to need to do a better job both in terms of partnerships and working in multiple agencies. Minnesota is not a state, unlike most of my friends on the East Coast, where we have 5 cops per 1,000. We have 1 to 2 cops per 1,000, and as a consequence, we all have to work together if we're going to be effective, because none of us have enough cops. The 800 cops that Minneapolis have, which is the biggest department in the state of Minnesota, was not going to be adequate to deal with 10,000 protesters if they were actively rioting. So we have to be able to work together. So that would be my second piece of this. And the third piece of this is I really do believe we're going to have a serious conversation with community about how do we communicate with them. this is not simply about policing, forcing people to do the right thing. I think there is a point at which, when we had a small number of looters and arsonists that were out there, going out and making those arrests absolutely did make a difference. And that's why we made making an arrest part of our strategy with the state assets as they went out there. But as important as that is making sure that the community that's out there understands what we're doing, why we're doing it, and that they are cooperative with us. Getting people to stay home once the curfew went into effect was a huge boost to our ability to move people, to be able to make arrests, and to hold the line without having to be fearful of what was lurking around the corner. So I think we do have to have a continuing conversation in terms of the community's part in this, in addition to making sure that the law enforcement and the police side of this is also ready and able to respond.
Senator Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioner. I have the same question for you as I asked of the general. Can you tell me how many state law enforcement officers were injured the week of the 25th, and can you give me some kind of an idea of what type of injuries?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Senator Hall, I do not have a detailed list. I'm woefully as unprepared in comparison with General Jensen is. I can certainly get you that information. Colonel Langer probably might have that information for state troopers. But I would have to go and have someone do a little more research on that. I know we did have officers injured and troopers injured. I remember we had troopers injured holding the line at the Midway Target. I know we had troopers that were hit with rocks and bottles and other objects when they were holding the line on Lake Street. I know that we had troopers that were injured by an IED with BBs that were shot out at them when we were trying to hold the line at the 5th Precinct. But a detailed list a la General Jensen, I would have to get to you at a later date.
If you would, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
I'd be happy to do so, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Commissioner, I just need you to clarify something for me, because I'm a little confused that the Friday morning's press conference, the governor basically announced that the state is going to take the lead in responding to the riots. But just earlier, you just said that Minneapolis was still doing their own thing on Friday, and that they weren't under the control of the governor. So were they two separate? Can you explain that relationship? I know that there's an AMAC, and I know there's supposed to be a coordination there, but that certainly doesn't sound like the state's got the lead on this. It sounds to me like you're still subservient to the Minneapolis PD and the mayor of Minneapolis. So if the governor is going to say he's taking the lead, can you clarify for us exactly how that relationship? Because it certainly doesn't sound like the state's got the lead on it if Minneapolis is still in control.
Commissioner Harrington.
Mr. Chair, Senator Howe, I think I can. The city of Minneapolis, which is the biggest police department in the state of Minnesota with 800-plus officers, was operating, and they were operating out of their own emergency operations center. That was where they were coordinating the 5 precincts that were running in Minneapolis, where they were running their investigative units and where they were running their intel function out of. The state, under the guidance of Governor Walz, came in and said, we're going to run a multi-agency coordinating group that we're going to run in concert with Minneapolis, but we're not going to dictate what Minneapolis does, nor were we going to take dictation from what Minneapolis, so Minneapolis wasn't able to dictate missions to the National Guard. They were not able to dictate missions to the State Patrol. They were not able to dictate missions to to the assets we had. They were able to make requests, as was Bloomington and as was West St. Paul and as were other agencies were able to make requests, and we were able to then vet those requests through the MAC to say, we can do your fire mission, we can do. We can do the anti-looting mission that you want us to do on Nicollet Mall. We have the resources to be able to do that. but we do not have the resources to take over policing in the city of Minneapolis. We do not have the resources available to be able to guard all the commercial corridors in Minneapolis. So we can take these tasks that you have given us, and then we will say to the chief of police in St. Paul, who also made requests, we can take these tasks that you have, and we can see to Chief Potts in Bloomington, we can help with these tasks there. So the multi-agency coordinating system was taking the lead on being responsive to the Twin Cities area in terms of resources necessary. But at the same time, St. Paul ran their emergency operations center and was running their 3 districts. They had membership in the MAC. We always had senior officials from both Minneapolis and St. Paul in the MAC so that we could coordinate our work together, but we were not dictating what Minneapolis or St. Paul was doing on any night.
Commissioner Hall, Senator Hall.
Thanks for the promotion, but
Some would argue that.
thank you, Mr. Chair. And so the governor's statement that morning that they were going to take the lead kind of misled the public, because the public, when you take the lead, you got the rose pinned on you. You're going to do the job. And that's when I heard the governor say, we're going to take the lead, we're going to lead the charge on the riots, he basically pinned the rose on himself. And when I looked at the news clippings and the video that we seen today of what happened on Friday night, I guess I'm not in agreement that the state had a great tactical plan on how they were going to do that. And I think that the separation between Minneapolis beating their own drum and the state having their own guidance and going their own direction, I seem to believe that that's kind of a disconnect. I don't think that was well coordinated by taking a look at the effects of that. I don't think it was well coordinated, and I truly believe that the governor misled the public saying, hey, we've got this is on us, we've got the lead. Wouldn't you agree that's kind of if when you say that I've got this is on us now, the state's got it, that's what he's leading the public to believe?
Commissioner Harrington.
Mr. Chair, Senator Howell, I believe what the governor said was that we have the lead. And when he said that, I think his intent was that the state now push and do more than simply wait for assignments. So, for example, taking back Lake Street was an assignment that the state leaned into. We put together the team that was going to take back Lake Street. We then mobilized that team, and we did that on our own. That was not done necessarily in concert with Minneapolis. That was a state-led initiative to do that, to try and clear Lake Street, to stop the fires, to get the fire trucks to where they needed to go. I believe that is in the message that the governor was saying, was that the state was going to take the lead in reducing. And I would argue that over the next 2 to 3 days, the state-led multi-agency coordinated group did take the lead in both holding the 5th precinct, taking back the 3rd precinct, taking back Lake Street on one night, holding downtown Minneapolis and not allowing the Nicollet Mall and the downtown area to burn, helping support St. Paul and holding the Midway area. I believe the state did take the lead in pulling the resources together to support the local jurisdictions, and in some cases we leaned in to take additional responsibilities that were falling between the cracks.
Senator Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Commissioner, I agree that Saturday and Sunday we had great success, and I think that plan kind of came together, but I will disagree with you that the plan was effective on Friday, and I expected it to be. When the state said they were going to have the lead, if you did that on Lake Street, with 451 soldiers available for Thursday evening, I fully expected that you were going to be effective Friday night, and we wouldn't have had the destruction, because if you could do that on Lake Street, you could have done that on other parts of Minneapolis, and because it looked to me like Minneapolis did not have it together. That's my final statement. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
If I can make a final statement to that?
Sure, Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Senator Howell, you and I are absolutely in agreement. Friday night was not my best night, not by a long shot. We had success clearing Lake Street and holding it from 3 o'clock till light. And we were, once again, and part of this is what you expect and what you know. And so we were expecting that we were dealing with a group of a couple thousand protesters, rioters, looters, and arsonists that were going to stay in a specific area, and that we were going to be able to meet them with essentially the mobile field force and be able to hold that line, make arrests, and that making that arrest and holding that line would have dissipated the threat. On Friday, what we encountered was Lake Street East. There were a couple thousand people there. 35W, there were 500 people there. The 5th precinct over on Grand or Nicollet and Lake, there's 4,500 people there. There are 1,000 people in downtown, and we're also getting reports that the 4th precinct in North Minneapolis and that St. Paul is now asking for additional resources. And frankly, we were prepared for a frontal battle in one area. And once we were able to mobilize and get all of the resources together, we pulled resources from other jurisdictions to pull the team together that went down and essentially kept the 5th precinct from burning. But we had to reconfigure our approach on Friday night in the face of more people and a different tactical approach by the folks that were out protesting than we had been expecting. By Saturday, part of what changed was we modified our tactical approach from a slow and go mobile field force where you have 100 people that are you move 100 people with a bunch of people with Humvees and a bunch of MRAPs in front of them. That doesn't move very fast, frankly. And we moved to a more rapid response model based on what we saw on Friday night, so that as we saw little eruptions spot up here and spot up there, we were able to send small groups that had all of the assets necessary to actually intervene, but they could get there in 30 minutes or less. And that, we think, is one of the things that was a game changer. Was we redeployed our tactical, and at the same time, we were getting more assets. And so it was possible to have multiple teams, smaller teams, and still have some big mobile field forces, because if you're going to hold the 5th precinct, you're still going to need that slow and go to hold that line. And so you and I are absolutely in agreement. The Friday night was an unpleasant surprise. I got outguessed tactically in terms of the numbers and the strategies. We quickly reconnoitered on Saturday. We changed that plan, and we used that new and more agile plan every day from that point on. And we think that more agile plan with the additional resources is what made the difference. That we weren't locked down to one location and only able to hold one location where, as in even on Thursday night, when we approached, if they disappear into the neighborhoods, you think about who I have on that line. I have troopers from Thief River Falls and Worthington who don't know Minneapolis. I've got National Guard guys here that are from Cook and from Nobles County who don't know North Minneapolis. And the idea that we should send 100 of them running into the neighborhood doesn't really seem like the best plan for us. A more small, mobile team was much more able to respond, encircle, make the arrest, and then get out without risking the safety of the staff that we had there. So we are in agreement on your optics of Friday night, and I think what we did, what the multi-agency coordinating group did, was smart policing the nights that fell thereafter.
Senator Giesecke.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, I was going to say Senator, Commissioner, former Senator Harrington. Again, as I told General Jensen, you know I represent Minneapolis, and so as a Minneapolis resident, thank you for all the work that you did to help with the situation. That was, as I said before, none of us, I don't think any of my constituents and a lot of people in Minneapolis, and I don't know how much you slept either during that week. It was interesting, would be one way of putting it.
It's ancient of Chinese curses, may you live in interesting times. Yes,
Yes.
I think we've lived through that in the last, well, between COVID and this, I think we
Yes.
certainly have met that threshold, so.
Yes. Thank you. I have a few questions. So Senator Osmick mentioned that there were a series of events to get to this disaster, and I'd like to go back to what started all of this. And it was one event. It was George Floyd's death. And so we're here today, you know, looking at state law enforcement response. And again, I thank you for that response. But I think we also need to look at law enforcement response to George Floyd's death. So I think we need to look at what can we as legislators do to limit and reduce excessive use of force. I also asked...
Senator Disick, I'm going to interrupt at this point. You have just jumped topics,
I'm not asking that as a question, I'm just pointing that out.
if I may, Senator. What we're talking about is the riots in Minneapolis, St. Paul, that began on May 26th. We are not here to talk about the police tactics that resulted in Mr. Floyd's death. I think that is a topic that we have to address. It is relevant and it's important, but so is this particular topic that we're addressing today. So I would ask you to please stay on topic if you would.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just pointing out that, you know, we are having this conversation, and I agree. I think the other conversation is also very important, and I think that is what a lot of people want us to be talking about. What I was going to continue to say was I also asked General Jensen, what do you think we as legislators can do to, you know, prevent the situation in response to the aftermath? So, you know, from your law enforcement response that you were part of helping to coordinate, what else up here that we can do? And you were a senator, so you have, you know, might have some ideas that some others don't. Do you think we should be looking at and working on so that, again, God forbid this ever happens again, and I truly hope it doesn't, that you or whomever is in your job in the future is better prepared and able to respond and learn from this incident?
Commissioner Harrington.
Chair, Senator Disick, and I appreciate, we actually talked during the riots on a number of occasions as you were checking in on your constituencies, and I was worried about whether I had to worry about the second precinct or not, as we were starting to think about whether other precincts were in fact going to come under attack. In answer to your question, I will echo once again one of General Jensen's comments, is the center where we coordinated things. That took us a day and a half to stand up, and so the State Emergency Operations Center, if it had been fully functioning and had been set up the way a MAC would have been set up, I think we would have been in a much better position. We would not have spent a number of hours trying to figure out where to have people meet, where can they park, where will we get resources, can we get the TV feeds, can we get cable feeds, can we get all the computer feeds in that all the intel people need to have, can we have a area where we can land, where we can have large vehicles that we sometimes needed. Do we have an area that's secure where we don't have to worry about bringing in National Guard guys and other law enforcement types to guard the facility? So all of those things would have aided us. One of the things that we talked about actually as we were starting to think about our after action report, which we're doing, was the inability of the MAC to be able to coordinate with the legislative side, and in an ideal SEOC, we would have had a place for public or government affairs so that you could have come in and gotten briefed, and so you would have gotten more information on a timely basis, and it would have been less of a guesswork, and it would have been far less chaotic as you were trying to make good decisions because you would have had more firsthand information about what was going on. We really do believe that the media is an important part of this, and we did not really couldn't stand up a JIC, a Joint Information Center, adequately, and so we were doing that piecemeal. So, so that center would certainly be an asset there. One of the things that we have talked about in the past, and I've mentioned it here before, is that the information is a key ingredient in our ability to plan and to mobilize people. And one of the things that I've asked for since I've been in this office is some additional capacity out of the Fusion Center, which runs out of the BCA, which is the state office that essentially takes all of the information in and becomes the sharing point for all other law enforcement. So we take all the feeds in from other law enforcement agencies and then we push it out as actually actionable intelligence. And we need more resources there. And so that's an area that we have talked about in the past, needing additional resources. The center is not on a 24/7 basis. And in this day and age, as Senator Howe and I think Senator Osmick both mentioned, I'm very concerned about the trial. I have flashback memories to the end of the Rodney King trial and what that did to L.A. And so I am not taking for granted that the fact that we have criminal charges against these individuals means that we will get a result that will not be repugnant to some members of the community, no matter which side of the line that they're on. And so having an active intel center that is actually asking the right questions, can dig into to that, I think is also important. And then the last piece of this I will add is I need your contacts, actually, and I know that sounds odd, but you are all in your own communities. You know your communities way better than I do, and for most of you that are not city folks, you know them completely better than I do because I get lost every time I try and come out to one of your areas to have a site visit, even to find the DVS center in Faribault. So you know your people and you know your law enforcement way better than I will ever know them. And having a vehicle so that we can share information, so that when you hear things, there's a place for you to go with that information, so that we can help you with that. Sometimes it's going to be disabusing you of rumor control that is just nonsense. But sometimes it's in fact going to be knowing that you have a tip on something that we hadn't heard about, and that it's absolutely essential. It's an essential piece of the information flow for us to be able to make good decisions. So I think we need to have a more robust relationship with the legislative houses to try and make sure that happens. It needs to feed into a information center where we can actualize that information, and then ultimately, well, God forbid we have another one of these, we need a place where we can operate out of, where we can do it without looking over our shoulder to figure out whether we're going to have our cars damaged, or where the vehicles that are being brought in to support us are going to be damaged, or whether we're going to have protesters circle where we're operating and thereby distract us from the mission that we have at hand.
Commissioner, to this answer, specifically to this answer, and Senator, I'll come back, but to this point, I think that's a good question. You mentioned two things specifically, better coordination and more information resources. Let me take you back to your previous statement where the city of Minneapolis, was running their organization, city of St. Paul's running their organization. You had sort of a joint command center involving some other resources. And that really surprised me. When Senator Howe was asking you about whether the state had taken over and was running things, I was surprised by your answer that the city of Minneapolis and St. Paul still were doing their own thing. So in respect to this last answer that you just gave, are you thinking or recommending that instead of having, say, 3 separate organizations that are addressing this criminal activity, that perhaps there should be one specific central government agency that is taking the lead and is addressing all of this, coordinating all of this that is necessary?
Mr. Chair, that makes me think too much of 1984, frankly, so I don't think that's what I'm suggesting. The model that we have operated, or that we would like to operate, is what we call a hub and spokes. And so that the BCA Fusion Center is the hub, and then we have spokes that go out. Now, some of those spokes are very robust, quite frankly. So Minneapolis has had historically a very high level of an intelligence or an information gathering network, and we get lots of crime data and lots of crime information from that particular center. St. Paul has also, in part because they're the two biggest departments in the state of Minnesota. I would argue.
I'm not talking about, Commissioner, a central control other than to address something like these riots. I'm not talking about, 1984, as you put it. But what you are describing is essentially three separate hubs addressing the riot. And in your mind, is that the best model to continue forward with?
Mr. Chair, no, I believe that my experience from whether it's the RNC or the Super Bowl is having one centralized coordinating area with one clear set of leadership in place has been probably the most effective model. That I think would probably be the textbook answer from the emergency management side that says you want a single point of command rather than having multiple points of command. That's not always possible, whether it is logistically possible or whether it is simply organizationally or governmentally possible. For example, whenever I work with the federal government, we are never in charge of the federal government. They always stand alone and run their own operation, even if they are running it in cooperation with our operation, which is what they did in this case. They stationed agents in the MAC while still running the FBI having their own intel center running at their headquarters. So there are going to be times when you cannot have everybody under one centralized command. But in an ideal world, I think centralized and unified command is, in fact, the textbook answer from an emergency management perspective of how you would want to operate.
Thank you, Commissioner. My apologies, Senator. Senator Dziedzic.
That's okay, Mr. Chair. I was going to point out, as Commissioner mentioned, we had multiple conversations, and one of them, I don't know if it was when I called you in a panic or if it was Katie Knutson that I called in a panic because I was watching the news and whatever channel I was watching reported that former officer, Chauvin, or however you say his name, was released.
I do remember that call. So.
Yes, because I thought, and it was like Sunday evening, and I thought, this is really not good. But since I had worked at Hennepin County, and that's where he was charged, I went on the site and it said, it looked like he was released. But then I went to the next page and it looked like it would appear to be released to another state agency, but that's not what the news reported. And so luckily I had, multiple phone calls and multiple phone numbers to panically call and say, can you correct that if that is wrong? Because that's not really going to be helpful right now. And so that's just an example. And so, I appreciate you sharing your phone number and actually answering it, and the same for your staff, actually answering it, when we called or text. So thank you for that. And then you briefly talked about the after incident or after action report. And so I think we've talked about that before. So are you doing one that is the state response, and then does that wrap in Minneapolis and St. Paul's response, and what are you doing with that?
Mr. Harrington.
Mr. Chair, Senator Dziedzic, we have an after-action report that is currently in progress. That's an internal document. It is the state police, the state patrol, DNR, and all the other state agencies, and anyone else that came, the 80-some-odd agencies that came together under the MAC. So we've asked all of them to participate in our sort of internal look to say, what did we do right, what did we do wrong, and what would we do better in the future. In addition to that, though, and this is just sort of my experience having lived through the RNC and a few other things. We are putting out an RFP, request for proposal, for an independent external review. And what we're hoping for by having an independent external review is that we will have a document that the community and that we'll share with the legislature, obviously, that will be able to pull in some of those other threads. Because our focus is what was the state response from the time that we took ownership and began operating as a multi-agency coordinating group. But clearly, there are days before that that led up to that response, and there will be days afterwards that we think probably need to be looked at. And so we will put out this RFP, and that review will still be focused on state, but we're going to ask Minneapolis and St. Paul to participate in that as part of an outside review. And I assume that I do not know whether they are doing their own outside review. It would be unusual for an event of this magnitude not to have a hot wash, at least to look back at lessons learned. But we are going to do that both from an external perspective and an internal perspective so that we have a very clear recitation of what happened and what we should have done. And I will quote Colonel Langer once again, that, you know, we're not perfect. We don't think we did this all right. I will say again that Friday was not our best day. There are lessons to be learned from those experiences, and if we are smart, and I think we are, we're not going to repeat those lessons. We're not going to have to go down that same road again and see that same result.
Senator Yazinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Commissioner, thank you. So we asked the question of General Jensen as well, and I want to ask it again. So do you believe it's a fair statement to say that less destruction would have occurred in the Twin Cities if the state troopers and other law enforcement had been called in sooner with more use of force?
Commissioner Harrington.
Mr. Chair, Senator Jasinski, I could meet you halfway on that one. I think if we had had more resources and we'd had the right tactical response, we could have seen less criminal activity and less destruction of property and less violence. I'm not certain that use of force is the key in this at all. Frankly, in most of the cases where we were actually very successful, the use of force was pretty de minimis. We did use some gas on occasion. We did use some marking rounds on occasion. But in terms of the different levels of force that you could have been used, we were, I think, very restrained. We maintained the values that the troopers and other state police and others, and they fell into line with us. And the National Guard fell in line with us as they were assisting our law enforcement people. And so you didn't see a lot of excessive use of force, and you didn't see actually a lot of force. We would make our announcement. We would put people in the right position. We would put them in a position where there was not a place to run, which is the right tactics by a mobile field force, and then you'd go in and you'd make your arrests, and you'd go and process them, and you didn't have a lot of necessary fights. Now, we did have some objects thrown at us. We did have some things, and we had to defend ourselves, but once again, there wasn't a lot of force necessary. That was much more having to be in a defensive posture because we were holding a line at that point.
And maybe I'll restate use of, thank you, Senator Newman. And maybe I'll restate use of force, but use of numbers, just the sheer numbers of people that were out there, and the police presence, I guess, is a better word than use of force. So I'll correct myself. Police presence, more, as we saw a reporter, one of the, I think Julie Nelson on KARE 11 said, you know, where are the police? Where is everybody? So more use of numbers is my, if I restate it that way, how would you answer?
Mr. Chair, Senator Jasinski, the numbers help. There's no doubt about that, and especially when you're suddenly confronting potentially 10,000 people and you've got a couple of hundred, you feel badly outnumbered and you question the wisdom of whether you should insert your people into a situation that you're not sure that you can get them in and out of. And I'm a big believer that you don't send troops or cops into a situation that you don't have an exit strategy for. And so the numbers absolutely bolstered our confidence that if we sent a group of people in to handle an area, that we could in fact handle our business and do it safely and make our arrests. So we definitely I think that is definitely the case. We also believe that The strategic use of arrests, as in the use of the curfew, allowed us to arrest the right people, and by making the right arrests at the right time, that provided an optics for others who might have been thinking about, well, I'll just come out and do something, and then they saw 115 people going to jail, or they saw a couple hundred people going to jail, and all of a sudden, I think for a lot of folks that were on the fringe, this no longer looked like such a great idea, but it took a certain number of Humvees and squad cars and men and women standing shoulder to shoulder to hold a line so that people couldn't escape, for that optic to be the operative vision of what was going on the streets of Minneapolis and on the streets of St. Paul.
Okay, thank you, thank you, Commissioner.
Senator Franzen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, again for being here. Just want to give some people and members context too of we keep concentrating on Minneapolis and St. Paul, but I represent a suburb and I have a border with Minneapolis. I have Edina, Bloomington, Eden Prairie, Minnetonka. You mentioned Chief Potts, and he's my chief of police in Bloomington, who is very engaged, obviously. For obvious reasons, Bloomington has a Mall of America and also has the airport. So we were concerned about the same issues of what if this spills over to other communities. In fact, the same day that the state had the curfew, I got the call from the governor's office saying that they were going to have a curfew. I said, what about other communities? My community needs a similar curfew. Can we be added? Because I had talked to the mayor of Bloomington. So there was ability for other communities to implement that curfew. I think a lot of members on this committee might have had that happen, obviously Minneapolis and St. Paul, but all of my cities that I just mentioned, all of them implemented a curfew starting on the 30th, ending on June 1st, the Monday. Maybe not in Rockford, maybe not in St. Cloud, but a lot of us were just as sleep deprived because we're right next to Minneapolis and St. Paul. So a lot of communities instituted a curfew, Hopkins, others. And I hear all the people seeing in the news, Senator Osmick, you mentioned that from your district. I don't know if your district had a curfew, but this spilled over all over the state. And you're in charge of not just Minneapolis, St. Paul, you're in charge of all over the state. So your comments about having us help you be more ingrained and more tactical in the areas, the communities that we serve and we represent. It's a partnership, and we can stand here all day complaining or being critical. It's our job to do so, but I don't think a lot of folks might have the understanding how large this was, of how much input was coming your way. I remember talking to my mayor in Edina, and we had credible threats. In my estimation, over and over again, I kept getting emails and texts and Facebook posts like, oh, they're coming to 50th and France. So we're like, what are we going to do there? Is it a credible threat? So we were funneling all that information to your command center through Senator Dietzig, through Senator Kent, through anyone we can find, because we didn't have a clear line of command, and that's a learning that we should have something in place in case, God forbid, it happens again, that we are prepared, because people come to us as the legislators in our districts. What do we know? You saw the comments about where's the governor, but in my district, they don't. It's like they're asking me, what do I know? What can I tell them? And as soon as we got the city council hold a Zoom meeting that there was a curfew, my job is to share it with all my constituents as far and wide as I can so people can stay safe. And it was a matter of a couple hours that there was a curfew instituted in my district and some of my communities. People didn't know about it. They complained about it too. But it's for certain. I mean, this is how quickly this all escalated, that if you're in the first, second ring suburbs, you felt it more than you did in a St. Cloud or Duluth or other communities. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm just saying there was a different level of tension happening and so much information. And I knew I couldn't call Senator Torres Ray. She's a dear friend of mine. I knew I couldn't talk to her because I knew she was extremely inundated in the middle of everything. I couldn't ask her. She would know, but I couldn't ask her. I knew she couldn't have the bandwidth. And I'm assuming your phone was going off the hook. But so we can be critical, and I think that's our job to go back and say this could have been done better. But we just had a few hours with Adjutant General Jensen, and I feel like we had the same questions but a completely different tone. And I just asked, I was sharing with my colleague next door to me here, we're asking almost the same questions, but the tone is completely different. And it was the same issue we were talking about a couple hours ago. So we can be critical. We were all in this together. The National Guard did a great job, and they were called in by the state, by the governor. So if we want to be critical of the governor, I think we should have a space for him to come and talk to us about his thinking instead of asking Commissioner to, have his opinion about what the governor said. We can hear from him if we need to. It's just, people want to know facts, and people want to know what was going through people's heads, but remember that we also had COVID on top of this. So we had a command center for COVID on top of everything. So the stress and the strain on our system was unparalleled, uncomparable. We've never been in that situation. And I just want to bring a perspective from a neighbor next door to Minneapolis where we also had a lot of tension, and our city leaders were also going through a lot of tension, and we're in the midst of it because it could have, it could have spilled over, and we were literally on alert. And I saw barricades in Edina. I saw barricades in areas where I'm like questionable. Why are those there? Well, because we were preparing for the worst, and I think now we know what the worst can look like, and I do think that we need to have a plan for those trials because people want justice, and people have a different perspective of what justice means, and we don't know what that's going to look like. We can't predict what our judicial system is going to have in terms of an outcome. But we do need to keep people safe. I have neighbors in Minneapolis, friends of mine, who were literally didn't sleep guarding their houses. You saw it on the news. I had friends with little kids who had the National Guard barricade their street. It's tenuous, and that we respond fast enough. I don't know how we could have done more than what was done, and in retrospect, I'm sure we would have done more, but it's just hard to quantify. So if there's a way that we can have an objective review of what the state's response, as objective as we can, so we can learn from it. I know you're doing your internal one, but if we can also ask for one externally, and I don't know if there's a process for that, but I think it would be valuable, so then we could take ourselves out of the, out of our emotions and get real data that we need to do it better if and when this happens. But I'm just concerned that we're having a different tone with a different testifier when we just had the same discussion a few hours ago, and it was very positive of what the state did. And I just think that should be put into perspective of, I don't think anyone wants any harm in any of our cities. And if this happened in Rockville or and I'm just picking on Senator Howe because it was his question about earlier, but how would that city respond? And when did they want the state to come in? Let's have those debates, because we don't know when the next tragedy is going to happen. And we can't prepare for everything, but at least we can learn a lot from this one. So thank you for doing the best you can. You're human, and for taking the tough questions. They're fair share. They're fair game. But I appreciate you doing the best you can to bring some sense of safety and sense of pride of what Minnesotans did in your shoes. So thank you again for being here, Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Senator Friends, and thank you very much.
Senator Rurick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I was actually going to begin my remarks by saying I know we're being a bit more critical, but I still think, I don't know if it's been said enough for your folks, thank you again. You were out on the streets those nights, and we need to thank you as much as we did the National Guard for being out there. So, but I do believe criticism tends to increase the higher up the chain you go. I think we all understand that as well. So I just have a couple of quick comments and then one question. And I know hindsight can, like I said, it's easy to look back, but I do recall talking with a number of people that week that we were saying, wow, if this is what's happening on these weeknights, what's going to happen on Friday and Saturday? So I think we did underestimate things quite a bit Friday night. You've admitted that, and And you brought up a point that I think a lot of people have been thinking about, and maybe not talking about, but with the trials coming up and the potential that is there, that I hope we're looking back and, saying, wow, if this is going to end on a Friday or a Saturday night, we better be a whole lot more prepared than if it's, say, a Tuesday night. Just my 2 cents on that. But I got a number of comments from people that I would just like to get you to help us understand. In one of the press conferences, you had made a statement that they had speed and tactical advantage over us in the early days of last week. And I had some people asking me, well, doesn't the state have the emergency command center and multiple agencies and helicopters and ability to communicate? And I've got some people that would just like to understand, is it through social media, things like that, and because they're just able to disappear into a crowd or into a neighborhood, that's what you were referring to? I had some people come up to me asking me about that. How could they have a tactical advantage over the state and our law enforcement agencies?
Commissioner Harrington.
Chair, Senator Greg, here's what I was referring to, and I think there's a couple of different levels to that. And I appreciate, first of all, I appreciate the criticism, and I appreciate the hard questions, because that's why I'm here. That's why I'm in this position. I'm going to learn from your questions and your points as to how we could do this better and how do we build the next best mousetrap so we don't get caught this way before. And we are going to learn from lessons learned, and we are going to do an external review because I really do believe we do need to have an objective lens to look at this. So all of those things. So I want you to know that I don't take the criticism personally. I think it's useful and I think it's educational. So bring it on. I'm not looking for a beating, but I will certainly take the hard questions because I'm going to learn more from them than throwing up softballs, frankly. So I'm quite happy to take whatever questions you have. In terms of the question about speed and tactics, it really is a function of how we operate. So as I said, on the night when we took Lake Street back, we mobilized 100 Minnesota State Patrol folks from all over into a mobile field force unit. We supplemented them with Hennepin County sheriffs, with some other local municipalities, and we then had some National Guard. We had a bunch of National Guard guys to supplement that. Okay, so figure that's a couple of hundred people having to move from point A, where you're staging, to a point B, where you're going to land, and then you're going to march into the area in mass, because part of what makes you a mobile field force is that you're the battle buddy for the guy next to you. So if there's a hole in your line, then the line's broken, and so we spend a lot of time drilling that we move as one, we move as unison. But moving a couple hundred people in unison is a lot slower than 20 kids in sneakers running into a neighborhood. And since we didn't have the tactical advantage of having a great deal of knowledge, it was at night, and so we had some limitations on aviation support, which is something that we would look to. One of the things that we did in the days that came is we made much better use of National Guard and the State Patrol's aviation assets to try and help us so that when we were out, and especially at night, we had better eyes on as to where people were going, so that we weren't running blind as they left from the 5th Precinct and began running. We could tell the folks on the ground they're heading south or they're heading east, and this is the next, because we've now got a big map in front of us. We can tell you where to block them off that's going to be the most effective, because otherwise we're playing whack-a-mole and we're just chasing them around, which doesn't really work. So they were younger and faster because they didn't have to carry around a whole suit of, gas mask and a bulletproof vest and a baton and wearing a vest and having a riot shield, and they're running for cover at that point. So that was certainly an advantage. One of the things that we recognized from that advantage was that much as you think of an asymmetrical warfare where you have guerrilla tactics, you don't use infantry to try and root out a guerrilla attack. You have to use special operations type tactics, and that became part of our mindset is that, well, what would be the small, fast, nimble, highly communicative approach to dealing with little groups of looters that were going to run off into an area so that we would not be, we couldn't catch them. That was the tactic that we moved into, and once we moved into that tactic, I would argue that they no longer had the tactical or the speed advantage on us because we had figured out how to change the dynamics of our deployment so that we were no longer slow and go. We were fast and nimble. While we continued to maintain, and this is one of the things I think is important to think about in terms of the resources we brought, we still needed to have that 100-person mobile field force slow and go operation at the ready if we had to go back and defend the 5th precinct. Because once you took the property, you might have to still stand there and protect it, and that wasn't going to be something that 20 people spread out was going to be able to do. So you really needed both the mobile field force and the rapid response team to be able to meet this particular set of needs.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, for coming. I really appreciate it again today. You requested some contact information. I put my cell phone here on the card, so after we're done today.
I'll exchange it with you. My cell phone's on my card.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So one of the things I'm really interested in this whole event that happened in early June was the early decision-making that happened. Now, I think there's part of that, it's a philosophy. You know, what we're dealing with is a protection of the First Amendment. So how do we allow people to, you know, peacefully assemble? How do we allow them to petition the government in a peaceful way? How do we protect the freedom of speech? And at some point early on, you know, I think there was a decision made on what degree we'd allow the gathering to happen. And I think you can go down the list from peaceful protest. We've heard a lot about civil disobedience. I think there's a spot there where that changed from civil disobedience to criminal disobedience and a riot. So I just had a couple of questions I wanted to ask and just to see what maybe that line is and where we have to start acting. So to begin with, I think we had a gathering at the site of George Floyd where he died. Was that, Commissioner, a peaceful protest, civil disobedience, or riot?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Senator Johnson, I'd have to answer this question ambiguously because it depended on at what moment in the continuum that was. There were moments where that absolutely was a memorial site where I had people sitting in prayer, people weeping, people bringing flowers, and it was absolutely no threat to anyone. I have had cases down there in the last couple of weeks where I've had shots fired, where people have come down there for other purposes, and we have had to go down there and assist, or Minneapolis has had to go down there, or Hennepin County's had to go down there to assist because there was criminal activity there. There were moments where the crowd from one protest swelled into that area, and it was a mix of folks who were maintaining the memorial with thousands of folks that had come from a march someplace else who, in some cases, had an entirely different agenda from the folks at the memorial. And that's one of those points where I mentioned before where it becomes much more difficult to sort the peaceful protesters from the folks who want to do criminal damage and want to hurt people. That becomes one of those places where it is such a crowd scene that trying to sort that out from the outside looking in becomes very, very challenging.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Commissioner. I think I couldn't agree with you more. I think it did start off as that peaceful memorial. But then later on, it got into, like you say, some of the criminal elements where we saw police cars being smashed up. And that was early on. That was that Tuesday, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. And if these questions been asked, I had to step out for a little bit, I'm sorry, so cut me off at any time. John, so it amped up to the police cars getting smashed up, and that was on Tuesday. And what I saw up in northwest Minnesota through the television screen was the police backing down. Those police cars, was that more of a civil disobedience, criminal disobedience, or a riot, Mr. Commissioner?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Senator Johnson, what I think you're describing was Minneapolis police primarily, and I really don't want to speak for the Minneapolis Police Department as to what their tactical decision was. I saw a similar video to you, and in my mind, I will reframe this slightly. So the first day of the Republican National Convention here in St. Paul, a group of anarchists pushed a dumpster that I believe they had lit on fire into the side of a bunch of my squad cars who were staged on West 7th Street. We had staged a protest zone directly in front of the XL Energy Center where we had been escorting peaceful protesters all day too. We would march them from the Capitol, we would walk them down, we would give them police escort. They had a time, they could speak their mind to the policymakers that were at the X. And clearly this group that were trying to set fires and damage squad cars and injure people did not have any connection to the peaceful protesters that were making their voices heard in the protest zone. We took different tactics with those two different groups. With the peaceful protesters, we made sure that they were escorted back to the Capitol so they could get to their cars and they could leave and the next group could come down. And we used bike rapid response, we used mobile field force, we used a variety of tactics to stop the criminal behavior that in other cities had literally destroyed their downtown. We were coming off of, we've been studying the experience of Seattle after the World Trade Organization riots, and so we were very aware of that some of the groups that had said they were coming to town had connections to that particular group, and we were very concerned that we were going to see windows broken and businesses occupied, and so we took a different tactical approach with that. Now, we had the benefit of months to research this. We had the benefit of doing the right intel work to know who was coming and who wasn't coming and to get a better sense of that so that we could set up our response appropriately to what we were likely to confront. On a 24-hour notice, my guess, and that is all this is because I have not had this conversation with MPD, is that I'm not sure that they knew what they were in the middle of at that point. I know we didn't know what we were in the middle of until probably a few days in as we began to pull people together into the MAC and started to share information. As Senator Franzen said, we began charting all of these Facebook posts of where people were going to come and rally. So I think that, I hope that is an answer to your question. It's a little roundabout, but I appreciate that.
I appreciate that.
Senator Johnson.
Yes, no, that's so, but the idea is that in both cases, you can recognize that criminal activity when it happens. And what I'm concerned about and what it looked like to me, being up north, is that we were a little flat-footed. Maybe it's an idea of philosophy on how long we let this go and the amount of steam that's being let off by these groups, or people that were there. But I think General Jensen said it well, and I'm probably butchering it, but quantity has its own mass. And as we watch that lawlessness, the civil turn into criminal disobedience, turn into a riot, we saw that gain. And I don't know if that's a philosophical or a political type thing, but that's something that I was very concerned about. Why wasn't that criminal element addressed, like you said, at the X when that started to happen? You got into action right away. Why didn't that action happen? So that's all I had. Thank you.
Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I sense that we're winding up. Is that true?
I'm sorry?
Are the sense that we're winding up? Is that your sense as well?
I believe so, yes.
All right, great.
We've got Senator Senjum right behind you,
All right.
and then we will be done.
Great.
I believe.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Well, thank you. I just wanted to say in response to Senator Johnson's inquiry that we know that there's going to be the post-event review as described by Commissioner Harrington, and RFP is going out on that soon or is being prepared.
It is being prepared even as we speak, sir.
Great, thanks. And I know that the city of Minneapolis likewise is going to be doing a post-event review and likely is going to retain the services of an objective third party. So these are all, fair questions to ask and questions that we would need the answers to. Who knew what when and, who made the decisions and were the decisions appropriate to the information and timely to the information that we had in hand. It's hard sitting here speculating and making assumptions about what the appropriate police response was at the right time and who was making what decisions, particularly in light of the fact that the majority leader, as soon as things started happening, was immediately pounding on the governor and criticizing him viciously on the media and has done that ever since. And so we're having this discussion in that context of a decision and a conclusion that's already been made by the leader of the caucus that's running this particular forum. So I look forward to those objective reviews so that we can get good information so that we can understand what exactly happened. Maybe a mighty show of force and a crackdown by the police is what's called for. Maybe not. And maybe sometimes the police antagonized and exacerbated and made circumstances worse. I saw police on video driving through downtown Minneapolis, just randomly, indiscriminately spraying pepper spray out the windows of people just on the sidewalks. What did that do to the whole situation of lawlessness that we're talking about? How did that antagonize and exacerbate and escalate the circumstances? We need to know the answers to those kinds of questions in a way that is conducted in a dispassionate, objective, non-political manner by a third party. And so I look forward to that information, and I will once again express my regret that, what time did we start this morning? 10 o'clock, and now it's 3 o'clock. And we've not really discussed racial justice and racial discrimination and the injustice that led to all of this unrest. Not 1 minute that we've devoted. And when people bring it up, they get gavelled down. I will point out, Mr. Chair, that in Mason's, says in committee proceedings, if I encourage you to look at section 632 of Mason's, that says that, in fact, conversations in committee by their nature should be relaxed in order to give free discussion and not handicap the work of the committee. So I'll point out this is a committee. It's two committees. We're not in actual formal session. We don't have legislation in front of us. So I appreciate you're trying to keep the discussion to what you want to talk about, but you really don't actually have the right to limit what members want to talk about, according to Mason's. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Dibble. Senator Limmer, to Senator Dibble's point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Dibble made a comment that the majority leader was somehow running this committee. Mr. Chairman, are you aware of any direction that the leader of our caucus or the majority leader in the Senate is running this committee?
Senator Limmer, in answer to that question, you as the chair of the Judiciary Committee and I as the chair in the Transportation Committee have been requested to hold a series of hearings on the riots in the city of Minneapolis and elsewhere beginning on May 26th and through the 10th of June. That's what I'm trying to do, and that's what the task is. The time to discuss what some of our members wish to discuss is not the topic of this series of hearings, and that's why I have tried to stay on point. But other than that, Senator Limmer, no, I have not been given any marching orders from the majority leader in the Senate.
Mr. Chairman, as a chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I have not received any direction from the majority leader either, Senator Dibble. And other than being in agreement that there should be some inquiry as to the events starting on the month or the dates of the disturbances coming from the George Floyd death and going forward for the next approximate 10 days is certainly an appropriate one. It's a historic one for us to review in order to determine the resources as well as the reaction by the government in order to protect life and property of our citizens when that does occur. I think that's an appropriate responsibility, and I don't believe there's been any control of our discussion or questions that we've been having over recent days. So, Senator Dibble, I just have to pause and correct you that the majority leader, other than agreeing that we should have this inquiry, is not in control, as you mentioned, of the procedures or the findings, whatever they will happen to be by the end of this
Mr. Chair.
week of inquiry.
Senator Dibble, is it
To this
to
point.
Senator Limmer's point?
Yeah, once again, what I
Okay.
have said has
Senator-
been completely,
Senator
thank you,
Dibble.
Mr. Chair, has been completely mischaracterized. As Senator Hall did yesterday, now Senator Limmer is completely mischaracterizing what I said. I go back and listen to the tape. I didn't say anyone was running this committee or controlling it. I mentioned the context in which we're having this hearing. And you said you were requested to hold these hearings. I assume by your majority leader, maybe not, maybe by someone else. But I stated a fact that your majority leader, from the moment civil unrest started, was on the media blaming the governor for his failure of leadership and has repeated those statements numerous times in the media since. You're part of the majority caucus. You have completely controlled the subject matter for this inquiry. We're, they're 13 hours in, and we've heard many conclusions that have been drawn by the majority about how things went down and how they assume things went down. And so this is not an objective inquiry of trying to get to the facts. People have their conclusions, and here we sit. I'm pointing out that we're going to have objective third-party analysis, and where we're going to get some good information where things went well and things didn't, and we're going to analyze all aspects and perspectives from professionals who can actually give us some good information. In the meantime, we have a huge lost opportunity where we're not really analyzing the dynamic, the circumstances, the socio-political moment that we're in that has given rise to the civil unrest in the first place, so that we can actually fashion a policy response that's responsive to what Minnesotans are telling us they want us to do. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Senchum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner, for being here today and for your service as well. This has been a hard month and a half. Not sure what it is anymore. The days seem to just roll by. But nonetheless, we know where you've been and how hard you worked and the tensions that you've endured. I just have a question. I actually wish that Minneapolis Police Chief was here, because I think it's probably more rightfully his, given the fact that you are, I believe that you kind of went on duty with respect to this at 12:05, according to the governor, at a certain day. Maybe it was Saturday morning. I'm not sure. But as we all looked, or at least as I all looked at this situation unfolded, and we can talk about the, I'll just call it a murder of George Floyd, because I think it was. And he will pay dearly for that for a good long time, maybe the rest of his life, I don't know. But going forth then, what as horrific as that is, and let's just accept the fact that it is and it was, what is also certainly unacceptable to me is the actions thereafter. Now, maybe I just don't understand, but the idea of, and we saw them in the videos, people running forth amongst Target stores, other stores, destroying, robbing, if you will, merchandise. I mean, that too is a crime. It's a lesser crime, there's no question about it, but it's still a crime. My question is, do you know if anything is being done relative to that kind of activity with respect to investigations? And we know that there's been a couple of arrests relative to arson and things like that, but there were hundreds of people doing this. They're on video. There are I'm sure there's enough cameras in those areas to know that there's license plates that could probably very easily be detected. Do you know if anybody in, say, the Minneapolis Police Department is doing any kind of work in terms of bringing that crime, if you will, to justice, those crimes?
Commissioner Harrington.
Mr. Chair, Senator Senjum, you're right that that's a question that's probably better posed to Chief Arredondo in terms of what the Minneapolis Police Department is doing. What I can tell you is that I initiated a arson task force while we were in the MAC, combining the State Fire Marshal, the arson investigators from the Minneapolis and St. Paul Fire Departments, and ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Thus far, they've made 13 felony arrests for arson and have made arrests all over the country based on the videos that we have been collecting and the literally bunker full of accelerants that we collected once we got involved in the investigation. So we are taking very seriously the criminal behavior that set about 150 different fires in the Twin Cities area during that period. And so we have about 90 different people that we have, I think, got pretty clear video on that we're working on that. We've also done some work on the looter crews that appear, and we're not necessarily sure that how closely related the looting and the fires and the protests are all. They all seem to happen contemporaneously and in the same proximity. But we had looting going on in West St. Paul. We had it go on in the just off of Maplewood. We had looter crews going up to Anoka, when we had no protests whatsoever in those areas, but they were breaking into phone stores. They hit pharmacies like crazy, trying to steal OxyContin and other pharmaceuticals. And so we are doing a separate investigation on the looting crews that we think may have simply been a separate criminal element. So we have the arsonists, we have the looters, and then there, as you said, there are folks there were crimes of opportunity. And I don't know whether Minneapolis is looking at those lower level crimes of opportunity or not. That's the question that is absolutely best posed to Chief Arredondo. If once the Target store windows were broken and the fires were set, were the people that walked out with a box of Similac at 4 o'clock in the morning, who they were is a little more nebulous, and that's not something that we have spent much time from the state police apparatus, whether it's the BCA, AGE, or the State Patrol, spending a lot of time looking at. But we are working currently with our federal partners to try and bring felony charges on as many people as we can, because once again, we believe that holding people accountable is in fact part of the justice system.
Good. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, for that question. We just can't make this acceptable activity. We just cannot accept this as acceptable activity, and to the extent I think society responds, we have to. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator. Members, that brings us to the conclusion. There are no more questions for the Commissioner. Commissioner Harrington, I again want to thank you for coming in. I always enjoy our exchanges. And I look forward to seeing you again. With that, members, we are adjourned.